Wendell spoke past Beck's ear to the children. "You kids like to sunfish?" "Yes!" Anne and Judy chorused. They were twins. "What's sunfish?" Donald asked. Going to the beach had been the children's only entertainment. Their mother was drugged and dazed. Norma detested physical activity before dark, and Beck was frightened of the water. Even the ferry ride over to the island felt precarious to him. He never sailed and rarely swam in water higher than his hips. From his apartment on Riverside Drive, he looked across to New Jersey as if the Hudson were a wide, flat, black street. "Let's do it tomorrow," Wendell said. "I'll come for them around 1, if that's okay, ma'am." Bea, flustered to find herself addressed, for Beck and Norma had almost enforced invisibility upon her, staging their fights and reconciliations as if she were not in the cottage, answered in her melodious, grief-slowed voice, "That would be lovely of you if you really want to bother. Is there any danger?" "Not a bit, ma'am. I have life jackets. I used to be a camp counselor." "That must have been when you shot your polar bear," Beck said, and pointedly restarted the motor. They arrived at the beach just as the sun went behind one of those irregular expanding clouds whose edges hold blue sky at bay for hours. The children, jubilant at freedom and the prospect of sun fishing, plunged into the surf. Norma, as if unwrapping a fragile gift in faintly poor taste, removed her beach robe, revealing a mauve bikini, and inserting plastic eye cups in her sockets, arranged herself in the center of a purple towel the size of a double bed. Bea, disconsolate in a loose brown suit that did not do her figure justice, sat down on the sand with a book, one of Beck's, curiously. Though her sister had been his mistress for 2.5 years, she had just got around to doing her homework. Embarrassed, fearful that the book so near his actual presence would somehow detonate, Beck moved off a few strides and stood, bare-chested, gazing at his splendid enemy, the sea, an oblivious hemisphere whose glitter of whitecaps sullenly persisted without the sun. Shortly, a timid adolescent voice, the voice he had been waiting for, rustled at his shoulder. "I beg your pardon, sir, but by any chance are you—" Wendell found Beck's diffident directions no obstacle and came for the children promptly at 1 the next day. The expedition was so successful, Beatrice prolonged her visit another week. Wendell took the children clamming and miniature golfing. He took them to an Indian burial ground, to an abandoned windmill, to grand beaches fenced with no trespassing signs. The boy had that wasp knowingness, that facility with things. He knew how to insert a clam knife, how to snorkel. Just to put on the mask made Beck gasp for breath. How to excite children with a few broken shell bits that remotely might be remnants of ceremonially heaped conch shells. He was connected to the land in a way Beck could only envy. Though so young, he had been everywhere. Italy, Scandinavia, Mexico, Alaska, whereas Beck, except for Caribbean holidays and a State Department-sponsored excursion to some communist countries, had hardly been anywhere. He lived 20 blocks north of where he had been born and couldn't sleep for nervousness the night before he and Norma and his rickety Ford risked the journey up the seaboard to the ferry slip. The continent-spanning motorcyclists of Travel Light had been daydreams based upon his Cincinnati sister's complaints about her older son, a college dropout. Wendell, a mere 23, shamed Beck with his Yankee ingenuity, his native woodcraft, the 1,001 tricks of a beach picnic, for instance, the oven of scooped sand, the corn salted in seawater, the fire of scavenged driftwood. It all seemed adventurous to Beck, as did the boy's removal in the amber summer twilight of his bathing suit to body surf. Wendell was a pudgy yet complete Adonis, stiff-armed in the waves, his buttocks pearly, his genitals distinctly visible when he stood in the wave troughs. The new generation was immersed in the world that Beck's, like a foolish old bridegroom full of whiskey and dogma, had tried to mount and master. Beck was shy of things and possessed few, not even a wife. Wendell's room above a garage on the summer property of some friends of his parents held everything from canned anchovies and a Bible to pornographic photographs and a gram of LSD. Ever since Bech had met her, Norma had wanted to take LSD. It was one of her complaints against him that he had never got her any. He, who knew that all her complaints were in truth that he would not marry her, told her she was too old. She was 36, he was 43, and though flirting with the senility that comes early to American authors, still absurdly wary of anything that might damage his brain. When, on their cottage porch, Wendell let slip the fact that he possessed some LSD, Bech recognized Norma's sudden new mood. Her nose sharpened, her wide mouth rapidly fluctuated between a heart-melting grin and a severe down-drawn look almost of anger. It was the mood in which, 2 Christmases ago, she had come up to him at a party, ostensibly to argue about The Chosen, in fact, to conjure him into taking her to dinner. She began to converse exclusively with Wendell. "Where did you get it?" she asked. "Why haven't you used it?" "Oh," he said, I knew a turned-on chemistry major. I've had it for a year now. You just don't take it, before bedtime, like Ovaltine. There has to be somebody to take the trip with. It can be very bad business." He had his solemn, whispering voice behind his boyish, naive one. "To go on a trip alone." "You've been?" Bech said politely. "I've been." His shadowy tone matched the moment of day. The westward sky was plunging toward rose. The sailboats were taking the final tack toward harbor. Inside the cottage, the children, happy and loud after an expedition with Wendell to the lobster hatchery, were eating supper. Beatrice went in to give them dessert and to get herself a sweater. Norma's fine lean legs twitched, recrossing, as she turned to Wendell with her rapacious grin. Before she could speak, Bech asked a question that would restore to himself the center of attention. "And is this what you write about now, in the classic manner of Ulysses movies?" Under the embarrassment of having to instruct his instructor, Wendell's voice dropped another notch. It's not really writable. Writing makes distinctions, and this breaks them down. For example, I remember once looking out my window at Columbia. Someone had left a green towel on the gravel roof. From sunbathing, I suppose, I thought, pretty green towel. Nice shade of green. Beautiful shade of green. And the color attacked me. Norma asked, "How attacked you? It grew teeth? Grew bigger? What?" She was having difficulty, Bech felt, keeping herself out of Wendell's lap. The boy's innocent eyes, browless as a teddy bear's, flicked a question toward Bech. "Tell her," Bech told him. "She's curious." "I'm horribly curious," Norma exclaimed. "I'm so tired of being myself. Liquor doesn't do anything for me anymore. Sex, anything." Wendell glanced back again toward Bech, worried. "It attacked me. It tried to become me. Was it wonderful? Or terrible?" "It was borderline. You must understand, Norma, it's not a playful experience. It takes everything you have." His tone of voice had become the unnaturally, perhaps ironically, respectful one he had used in English 1020. "It'll even take," Bech told her, "your Saks charger plate." Bea appeared in the doorway, dim behind the screen. "As long as I'm on my feet, does anybody want another drink?" "Oh, Bea," Norma said, leaping up. "Stop being a martyr. It's my turn to cook. Let me help you." To Bech, before going in, she said, "Please arrange my trip with Wendell. He thinks I'm a nuisance, but he adores you. Tell him how good I'll be." Her departure left the men silent. Sheets of mackerel shards were sliding down the sky toward a magenta sunset. Bech felt himself being sucked into a situation where nothing, neither tact nor reason, nor the morality he had learned from his father and Flaubert, afforded leverage. Wendell at last asked, "How stable is she?" "Very un. Any history of psychological disturbance?" Nothing but the usual psychiatry. Quit analysis after 4 months. Does her work apparently quite well. Layout and design for an advertising agency. Likes to show her temper off, but underneath has a good hard eye on the main chance. I'd really need to spend some time alone with her. It's very important that people on a trip together be congenial. They last at least 12 hours. Without rapport, it's a nightmare. The boy was so solemn, so blind to the outrageousness of what he was proposing, that Bech laughed. As if rebuking Bech with his greater seriousness, Wendell whispered in the dusk, "The people you've taken a trip with become the most important people in your life." "Well," Bech said, "I want to wish you and Norma all the luck in the world. When should we send out announcements?" Wendell intoned, "I feel you disapprove. I feel your fright." Bech was speechless. Didn't he know what a mistress was? No sense of private property in this generation. The early Christians. Brook Farm. Wendell went on carefully, considerately. "Let me propose this. Has she ever smoked pot?" "Not with me around. I'm an old-fashioned father figure. 2 parts Abraham to 1 part Fagin." "Why don't she and I, Mr. Bech, smoke some marijuana together as a dry run? That way she can satisfy her female curiosity and I can see if we could stand a trip together. As I size her up, she's much too practical-minded to be ahead. She just wants to make the 60s scene and maybe to bug you." The boy was so hopeful, so reasonable, that Bech could not help treating him as a student, with all of a student's purchased prerogatives, a student's ruthless power to intrude and demand. Young American minds. The space race with Russia. Bech heard himself yield. "Okay, but you're not taking her over into that sorcerer's apprentice cubbyhole of yours." Wendell puzzled. He seemed in the half-light a blameless, furry creature, delicately nosing his way through the inscrutable maze of the other man's prejudices. At last he said, "I think I see your worry. You're wrong. There is absolutely no chance of sex. All these things, of course, are sexual depressants. It's a medical fact." Bech laughed again. "Don't you dare sexually depress Norma. It's all she and I have anymore." But in making this combination of joke and confession, he had absolved the boy of the maze and admitted him more deeply into his life than he had intended. All because, Bech suspected, at bottom, he was afraid of being out of date. They agreed that Wendell would bring back some marijuana and they would give him supper. "You'll have to take pot luck," Bech told him. Norma was not pleased by his arrangements. "How ridiculous of you," she said, "not to trust me alone with that child. You are so immature and proprietorial. You don't own me. I am a free agent by your preference." "I wanted to save you embarrassment," he told her. "I have read the kid's stories. You don't know what goes on in his mind." "No. After keeping you company for 3 years, I've forgotten what goes on in any normal man's mind." "Then you admit he is a normal man, not a child. Okay. You stay out of that bastard's atelier, or whatever he thinks it is. A pad. My, aren't you the fierce young lover? I wonder how I survived 30-odd years out from under your wing. You're so self-destructive, I wonder too. And, by the way, it's not been 3 years we've been keeping company. It's 2.5. Well, you've been counting the minutes. Is my time about up? Norma, why do you want to cop out with all these drugs? It's so insulting to the world, to me. I want to have an experience. I've never had a baby. The only wedding ring I've ever worn is the one you loan me when we go to St. Croix in the winter. I've never been to Pakistan. I'm never going to get to Antarctica. I'll buy you a freezer. That is your solution, isn't it? Buy another box. You go from box to box, each one snugger than the last. Well, I, for one, don't think your marvelous lifestyle, your heady mixture of art for art's sake and depression funk entirely covers the case. My life is closing in, and I hate it, and I thought this way I could open it up a little, just a teeny crack, a splinter of sunshine. He's coming back. He's coming back. Your fix is on the way. How can I possibly get high with you and B sitting there watching with long faces? It's too grotesque. It's too limiting. My kid sister, my kindly protector. I might as well call my mother. She can fly up from West Orange with the smelling salts. Bech was grateful to her for letting her anger, her anguish, recede from the high point reached with the wail that she had never had a baby. He promised, "We'll take it with you." "Who will?" You and Bea?" Norma laughed scornfully. "You two nannies? You're the two most careful people I've ever met. We'd love to smoke pot. Wouldn't we, Bea? Come on, take a holiday. Break yourself of Nembutal." Beatrice, who had been cooking lamb chops and setting the table for 4, while Bech and her sister were obstructively gesturing in the passageway between the kitchen and the dining area, stopped and considered. Rodney would have a fit. "Rodney's divorcing you," Bech told her. "Think for yourself." "What makes it too ridiculous?" Norma protested. "It takes all the adventure out of it." Bech asked sharply, "Don't you love us?" "Well," Bea was saying, "on one condition. The children must be asleep. I don't want them to see me do anything wild." It was Wendell's ingenious idea to have the children sleep on the porch, away from what noise and fumes there might be. He had brought from his magical cache of supplies 2 sleeping bags, one a double, for the twins. He settled the 3 small cooks by pointing out the constellations and the area of the sky where they might, according to this week's newspapers, see shooting stars. "And when you grow tired of that," Wendell said, "close your eyes and listen for an owl." "Are there owls?" one twin asked. "Oh, sure." "On this island?" asked the other. "1 or 2. Every island has to have an owl. Otherwise the mice would multiply and there would be no grass. Just mice." "Will it get us?" Donald was the youngest, 5. "You're no mouse," Wendell whispered. "You're a man." Bech, eavesdropping, felt a pang and envied the new Americans their easy intermingling with children. How terrible it seemed for him, a Jew, not to have children, to lack a father's dignity. The 4 adults ate a sober and unconversational meal. Wendell asked Bech what he was writing now, and Bech said nothing. He was proofreading his old books and finding lots of typos. No wonder the critics had misunderstood him. Norma had changed into a shimmering housecoat, a peacock-colored silk kimono Bech had bought her last Christmas, their 2nd anniversary. He wondered if she had kept on her underclothes, and finally glimpsed, as she bent frowning over her overcooked lamb chop, the reassuring pale edge of a bra. During coffee, he cleared his throat. "Well, kids, should the seance begin?" Wendell arranged 4 chairs in a rectangle and produced a pipe. It was an ordinary pipe, the kind that authors, in the corny days when Bech's image of the literary life had been formed, used to grip on dust-jacket photographs. Norma took the best chair, the wicker armchair, and impatiently smoked a cigarette, while Beatrice cleared away the dishes and checked on the children. They were asleep beneath the stars. Donald had moved his sleeping bag against the girls and lay with his thumb in his mouth and the other hand on Judy's hair. Beatrice and Bech sat down, and Wendell spoke to them as if they were children, showing them the magic substance, which looked like a residue of pencil shavings in a dirty tobacco pouch, instructing them how to suck in air and smoke simultaneously, how to swallow the smoke and hold it down, so the precious narcotic permeated the lungs and stomach and veins and brain. The thoroughness of these instructions aroused in Bech the conviction that something was going to go wrong. He found Wendell as an instructor pompous. In a fury of puffing and expressive inhaling, the boy got the pipe going and offered first drag to Norma. She had never smoked a pipe and suffered a convulsion of coughing. Wendell leaned forward and greedily inhaled from midair the smoke she had wasted. He had become, seen sideways with his floppy blonde hair, a baby lion above a bone. His hungry, quick movements were padded with a sinister silence. "Hurry!" he hoarsely urged Norma. "Don't waste it. It's all I have left from my last trip to Mexico. We may not have enough for 4. She tried again. Bech felt her as tense, rebellious, all too aware that, with the pipe between her teeth, she became a sharp-nosed crone and coughed again and complained, "I'm not getting any." Wendell whirled, barefoot, and stabbing with the pipe stem, said, "Mr. Bech." The smoke was sweet and circular and soft, softer than Bech could have imagined. ballooning in his mouth and throat and chest like a benevolent thunderhead, like one of those valentines from his childhood that unfolded into a three-dimensional tissue paper fan. "More," Wendell commanded, thrusting the pipe at him again, ravenously sniffing into himself the shreds of smoke that escaped Bech's sucking. This time there was a faint burning, a ghost of tobacco's unkind rasp. Bech felt himself as a domed chamber with vaults and upward recesses, welcoming the cloud. He shut his eyes. The color of the sensation was yellow mixed with blue, yet in no way green. The base of his throat satisfyingly burned. While his attention was turned inward, Beatrice was given the pipe. Smoke leaked from her compressed lips. It seemed intensely poignant to Bech that even in depravity she was wearing no lipstick. "Give it to me," Norma insisted, greedily reaching. Wendell snatched the pipe against his chest and, with the ardor of a trapped man breathing through a tube, inhaled marijuana. The air began to smell sweetish, flowery, and gentle. Norma jumped from her chair and, kimono shimmering, roughly seized the pipe so that precious sparks flew. Wendell pushed her back into her chair and, like a mother feeding a baby, insinuated the pipe stem between her lips. "Gently, gently," he crooned. "Take it in. Feel it press against the roof of your mouth. Blossoming inside you. Hold it fast. Fast." His S's were extremely sibilant. "What's all this hypnosis?" Bech asked. He disliked the deft way Wendell handled Norma. The boy swooped to him and eased the wet pipe into his mouth. "Deeper, deeper. That's it. Good. Good." "It burns," Bech protested. "It's supposed to," Wendell said. "That's beautiful. You're really getting it. Suppose I get sick." "People never get sick on it. It's a medical fact." Bech turned to Beatrice and said, "We've raised a generation of amateur pharmacologists." She had the pipe. Handing it back to Wendell, she smiled and pronounced, "Yummy." Norma kicked her legs and said savagely, "Nothing's happening. It's not doing anything to me." "It will. It will," Wendell insisted. He sat down in the fourth chair and passed the pipe. Fine sweat beaded his plump, round face. "Did you ever notice," Bech asked him, "what nifty legs Norma has? She's old enough to be your biological mother, but condescend to take a gander at her gams. We were the sinewy generation." "What's this generation bag you're in?" Wendell asked him, still rather respectfully English 1020. "Everybody's people." "Our biological mother," Beatrice unexpectedly announced, "thought actually I had the better figure. She used to call Norma Nobby." "I won't sit here being discussed like a piece of meat," Norma said. Grudgingly, she passed the pipe to Bech. As Bech smoked, Wendell crooned, "Yes, deeper. Let it fill you. He really has it. My master, my guru." "Guru you," Bech said, passing the pipe to Beatrice. He spoke with a rolling slowness, sonorous as an idol's voice. "All you flower types are incipient fascists." The A's and S's had taken on a private richness in his mouth. "Fascists manqué," he said. Wendell rejected the pipe Beatrice offered him. "Give it back to our teacher. We need his wisdom. We need the fruit of his suffering." "Manqué si, manqué do," Bech went on, puffing and inhaling. "What a woman must feel like in coitus. More. More." "Mon maître," Wendell sighed, leaning forward, breathless, awed, loving. "Suffering," Norma sneered. "The day Henry Bech lets himself suffer is a day I'm dying to see. He's the safest man in America since they retired Tom Dewey. Oh, this is horrible. You're all being so silly, and here I sit perfectly sober. I hate it. I hate it. I hate all of you, absolutely." "Do you hear music?" Bech asked, passing the pipe directly across to Wendell. "Look at the windows, everybody. People," Beatrice said. "They're coming into the room." "Stop pretending," Norma told her. "You always played up to Mother. I'd rather be Nobby Norma than Bland B." "She's beautiful," Wendell said to Norma of Beatrice. "But so are you. The Lord Krishna bestows blessings with a lavish hand." Norma turned to him and grinned, her tropism to the phony like a flower's to the sun, wide, warm mouth wherein memories of pleasure have become poisonous words. Carefully, Bech asked the other man, "Why does your face resemble the underside of a colander in which wet lettuce is heaped?" The image seemed both elegant and precise, cruel yet just. But the thought of lettuce troubled his digestion. Grass. All men, things grow in circles. Stop the circles. "I sweat easily," Wendell confessed freely. The easy shamelessness purchased for an ingrate generation by decades of poverty and war. "And write badly," Bech said. Wendell was unabashed. He said, "You haven't seen my new stuff. It's really terrifically controlled. I'm letting the things dominate the emotions instead of vice versa. Don't you think, since the wake, emotions have about had it in prose?" "Talk to me," Norma said. "He's absolutely self-obsessed." Wendell told her simply, "He's my God." Beatrice was asking, "Whose turn is it? Isn't anybody else worried about the windows?" Wendell gave her the pipe. She smoked and said, "It tastes like dregs." When she offered the pipe to Bech, he gingerly waved it away. He felt that the summit of his apotheosis had slipped by, replaced by a widespread sliding. His perceptions were clear. He felt them all trying to get through to him. Norma seeking love, Wendell praise, Beatrice a few more days of free vacation. But these arrows of demand were directed at an object in metamorphosis. Bech's chest was sloping upward, trying to lift his head into steadiness, as when 30 years ago, carsick on the long subway ride to his Brooklyn uncle's, he would fix his eyes in a death grip on his own reflection in the shuddering black glass. The funny wool Buster Brown cap his mother made him wear, his pale, small face, old for his age, the ultimate deliverance of the final stomach-wrenching stop. In the lower edge of his vision, Norma leaped up and grabbed the pipe from Beatrice. Something fell. Sparks. Both women scrambled on the floor. Norma arose in her shimmering kimono and majestically complained, "It's out! It's all gone! Damn you, greedy bee!" "Back to Mexico," Bech called. His own voice came from afar, through blankets of a gathering expectancy, the expanding motionlessness of nausea. But he did not know for a certainty that he was going to be sick until Norma's voice, a few feet away in the sliding obfuscation, as sharp and small as something seen in reversed binoculars, announced, "Henry, you're absolutely yellow." In the bathroom mirror, he saw that she was right. The blood had drained from his long face, leaving like a scum the tallow of his summer tan, and a mauve blotch of sunburn on his melancholy nose. Face he had glimpsed from 1,000 pits, in barbershops and barrooms, in subways and airplane windows above the Black Sea. Before shaving and after lovemaking, it witlessly smiled, the eyes very tired. Bech kneeled and submitted to the dark ecstasy of being eclipsed, his brain shouldered into nothingness by the violence of the inversion, whereby his stomach emptied itself repeatedly until a satisfying pain scraped tears from his eyes, and he was clean. Beatrice sat alone in the living room beside the dead fireplace. Bech asked her, "Where is everybody?" She said, unmoving, uncomplaining, "They went outside, and about 2 minutes ago I heard his car motor start." Bech, shaken but sane, said, "Another medical fact exploded." Beatrice looked at him questioningly. Flirting her head, Bech thought, like Norma. Sisters. A stick refracted in water, our biological mother. He explained, A, the little bastard tells me it won't make me sick, and B, he solemnly swears it's a sexual depressant. You don't think... They went back to his room? Sure. Don't you? Beatrice nodded. That's how she is. That's how she's always been. Bech looked around him and saw that the familiar objects, the jar of dried bayberry, the loose shell collection, sandy and ill-smelling, the damp stack of books on the sofa, still wore one final, gossamer thickness of the mystery in which marijuana had clothed them. He asked B, "How are you feeling? Do the windows still worry you?" "I've been sitting here watching them," she said. "I keep thinking they're going to tip and fall into the room, but I guess they won't, really." "They might," Bech told her. "Don't sell your intuition short." "Please, could you sit down beside me and watch them with me? I know it's silly, but it would be a help." He obeyed, moving Norma's wicker chair closer to Bea, and observed that indeed the window frames, painted white in unpainted plank walls, did have the potentiality of animation and a disturbing pressingness. Their center of gravity seemed to shift from one corner to the other. He discovered he had taken Bea's hand, limp, cool, less bony than Norma's, into his. She gradually turned her head, and he turned his face away, embarrassed that the scent of vomit would be still on his breath. "Let's go outside on the porch," he suggested. The stars overhead were close and ripe. What was that sentence from Ulysses? Bloom and Stephen emerging from the house to urinate? Suddenly looking up, the heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit. Bech felt a sadness, a terror, that he had not written it, not ever. A child whimpered and rustled in its sleep. Beatrice was wearing a loose, pale dress, luminous in the air of the dark porch. The night was moist, alive. Lights along the horizon pulsed. The bell buoy clanged on a noiseless swell. She sat in a chair against the shingled wall, and he took a chair facing her, his back to the sea. She asked, "Do you feel betrayed?" He tried to think, scanned the scattered stars of his decaying brain for the answer. "Somewhat. But I've had it coming to me. I've been getting on her nerves deliberately. Like me and Rodney." He didn't answer, not comprehending and marveling instead how, when the woman crossed and recrossed her legs, it could have been Norma, a gentler, younger Norma. She clarified, "I forced the divorce." The child who had whimpered now cried aloud. It was little Donald, pronouncing hollowly, "The owl!" Beatrice, struggling for control against her body's slowness, rose and went to the child, kneeled and woke him. "No owl," she said, "just Mummy." With that ancient, strained strength of mothers, she pulled him from the sleeping bag and carried him back in her arms to her chair. "No owl," she repeated, rocking gently, "just Mummy and Uncle Harry and the bell buoy." "You smell funny," the child told her. "Like what funny?" "Like sort of candy." "Donald," Bech said, "we'd never eat any candy without telling you. We'd never be so mean." There was no answer. He was asleep again. "I admire you," Beatrice said at last, the lulling, rocking motion still in her voice, "for being yourself." "I've tried being other people," Bech said, fending, but nobody was convinced. "I love your book," she went on. "I didn't know how to tell you, but I always rather sneered at you. I thought of you as part of Norma's phony crowd, but your writing, it's terribly tender. There's something in you that you keep safe from all of us." As always, when his writing was discussed to his face, a precarious trembling entered Bech's chest, a case of crystal when heavy footsteps passed. He had the usual wild itch to run, to disclaim, to shut his eyes in ecstasy. "More. More." He protested, "Why didn't anybody at least knock on the door when I was dying in the bathroom? I haven't whoopsed like that since the army. I wanted to, but I couldn't move. Norma said it was just your way of being the center of attention." That bitch. Did she really run off with that woolly little prep school snot? Beatrice said, with an emphatic intonation dimly, thrillingly familiar, "You are jealous. You do love her." Bech said, "I just don't like creative writing students pushing me out of my bed. I make a good Phoenician sailor, but I am a poor fisher king." There was no answer. He sensed she was crying. Desperately changing the subject, he waved toward a distant light, whirling, swollen by the mist. "That whole headland," he said, "is owned by an ex-member of the Communist Party, and he spends all his time putting up no trespassing signs." "You're nice," Beatrice sobbed, the child at rest in her arms. A motor approached down the muffling sandy road. Headlights raked the porch rail, and doubled footsteps crashed through the cottage. Norma and Wendell emerged onto the porch, Wendell carrying a messy thickness of typewriter paper. "Well," Bech said, "that didn't take long. We thought you'd be gone for the night. Or is it dawn?" "Oh, Henry," Norma said, "you think everything is sex. We went back to Wendell's place to flush his LSD down the toilet. He felt so guilty when you got sick." "Never again for me, Mr. Bech. I am out of that subconscious bag. Hey, I brought along a section of my thing. It's not exactly a novel. You don't have to read it now if you don't want to." "I couldn't," Bech said. "Not if it makes distinctions." Norma felt the changed atmosphere and accused her sister. "Have you been boring Henry with what an awful person I am? How could the two of you imagine I'd misbehave with this boy under your noses? Surely I'm subtler than that." Bech said, "We thought you might be high on pot." Norma triumphantly complained, "I never got anything, and I'm positive the rest of you faked it." But when Wendell had been sent home and the children had been tucked into their bunks, she fell asleep with such a tranced soundness that Bech, insomniac, sneaked from her side and safely slept with Beatrice. He found her lying awake, waiting for him. By fall, the word went out on the literary circuit that Bech had shifted mistresses again. Bech wed. Bech married Beatrice Latchett, formerly cook, in a civil ceremony in Lower Manhattan on an April afternoon of unseasonable chill and spitting snow. She was the younger, gentler sister of a mistress he had known for years and with whom he had always fought. He and Bea rarely fought, and at his age this appeared possibly propitious. He had married her to escape his famous former self. He had given up his apartment at 99th and Riverside, an address consecrated by 20 years of who's who's, to live with Bea in Ossining, with her twin girls, Anne and Judy, and only son, Donald. The house in Ossining was a tall mock Tudor with an incongruous mansard roof set on a domed lawn against a fringe of woods on an acre and a half tucked somewhere between the Taconic State and the Briarcliff-Peekskill parkways. Its exterior timbers were painted the shiny, harsh green of park benches, and its stucco had been aged to a friable tan. The interior abounded in drafty, wasteful spaces, echoing entrance halls and imperious wide staircases and narrow windowless corridors for vanished servants to scuttle along. Bea and Rodney, while their marriage thrived, had fixed it up, scraping the white and then, next layer down, the dusty rose paint off the newel posts and banisters until natural oak was reached. They had replaced all the broken glass and fragmented putty in the little greenhouse that leaned against the library, retiled the upstairs bathrooms, replastered the backstair walls, and laid down a lilac hedge and a composition tennis court. As their marriage ran into difficulties, the scraping stopped halfway up the left-hand banister, and the tennis court was taken over by the neighborhood children and their honey-limbed babysitters. Now Bech was installed in the mansion like a hermit crab tossed into a birdhouse. The place was much too big. He couldn't get used to the staircases and volumes of air they arrogantly commandeered, or the way the heat didn't pour, knocking out of steam radiators from an infernal source concealed many stories below, but instead seeped from thin pipes, sneaking low around the baseboards, pipes kept warm by personalized monthly bills and portentous wheezing visits from the local oil truck. In the cellar you could see the oil tanks, two huge rust-brown things greasy to the touch. And here was the furnace, an old converted coal burner in a crumbling overcoat of plastered asbestos, rumbling and muttering all through the night like a madman's brain. Bech had hardly ever visited a basement before. He had lived in the air, like mistletoe, like the hairy sloth, Manhattan's subgenus. Though he had visited his sister in Cincinnati and written his freshest fantasy, Travel Light, upon impressions gathered during the avuncular visits there, he had never in his bones known before what America was made of. Lonely outposts, log cabins chinked with mud and moss. Insulation was a constant topic of conversation with the neighbors, and that first winter, Bech dragged his uprooted crab tail back and forth to the building supply center along Route 9 and hauled home in B's sticky-geared Volare station wagon great rolls of pink insulation backed by silver paper. With a hardening right hand, he stapled this cumbersome, airy material between the studs of an unused and never plastered third-floor room intended for servants or storage, and made himself, all lined in silver imprinted with the manufacturer's slogans, a kind of dream image, a surreal distillation of his cloistered, forsaken apartment high above the windswept corner of 99th and Riverside. Here, his shins baking in the intersecting rays of 2 electric heaters, he was supposed to write. Write? He said to B, who had proposed this space allocation. How do you do that? You know, she said, not to be joshed. It'll all come back to you now that you're settled and loved. His heart, which had winced at settled, fled from the word loved so swiftly that he went momentarily deaf. These happy conditions had nothing to do with writing. Happiness was not the ally, but the enemy of truth. Dear B, standing there in her slightly shapeless house dress, her fair hair straggled out in the dishevelment of utter sincerity, seemed a solid obstacle to the translucent on-running of the unease that was Bech's spiritual element, his punctilious modernist diet. Too complacent in her seventh-hand certainty, descended from Freud, that she held between her soft thighs the answer to all his questions, B assumed that the long sterile stretch of his unwed life before her had been simply a mistake, a wandering in a stony wilderness cluttered with women and trips. He doubted it was that simple. Being an artist was a matter of delicate and prolonged maneuver. Who could tell where a false move lay? Think of Proust's, think of Rilke's, decades of procrastination, the derangement of the senses Rimbaud had prescribed. Didn't all of Hart Crane's debauchery find its reason in a few incandescent lines that burned on long after the sullen waves had closed upon his suicide? What you must do, B told him, even as her blue Scots eyes slid sideways toward some other detail of housekeeping, is go up there first thing every day and write a certain number of pages. Not too many, or you'll scare yourself away. But do that number, Henry, good or bad, summer or winter, and see what happens. Good or bad? He asked, incredulous. Sure, why not? Who can tell anyway in the end? Look at Kafka, whom you admire so much. Who cares now if America isn't as good as Das Schloss? It's all Kafka, and that's all we care about. Whatever you produce, it'll be Bech, and that's all anybody wants out of you. Mehr Licht, mehr Bech. He hadn't known she knew all this German. I don't admire Kafka, he grumbled, feeling a child's pleasurable restiveness. I feel him as an oppressive older brother. He affects me the way his father affected him. What you're doing, B told him, is punishing us. Ever since The Chosen got panned, you've been holding your breath like an angry baby. Enough now. Finish, think big. The title of his new novel had abruptly come to Bech. It balanced the title of his first, Travel Light. I was thinking of changing it to Easy Money, he said now. Good. A much better title. I think the old one intimidated you. But it's about New York. How can I write about New York when you've taken me away from it? All the better, B briskly said, patting her hair in closer to the luminous orb of her face. New York was a terrible place for you. You were always letting yourself get sidetracked. Who's to say, he asked, giving his old aesthetic one more try, what a sidetrack is? Simple. It's the one that doesn't lead anywhere. Do what you want with your talent. Hide it under a bushel. I can't stand here arguing forever. From the sounds out back, Donald and his friends are doing something terrible to the dog. It was true. Donald and 2 pals from a house across the lane were trying to play rodeo with Max, a sluggish old golden retriever that Rodney and B had bought as a puppy. He had yelped when lassoed, and then, as the boys were being scolded, hung his tail, ashamed of having tattled. Bech had never lived in close conjunction with a dog before. He marveled at the range of emotion the animal could convey with its tail, its ears, and the flexible loose skin of its muzzle. When he and B returned from the supermarket or an expedition to the city, old Max, in his simple-minded joy, would flog the Volare fenders with his tail and, when his new master bent down to pat his head, would slip Beck's hand into his mouth and try to pull him toward the house, retrieving him, as it were. The grip of the dog's teeth, though kindly meant, was firm enough to give pain and to leave livid marks. Bech had to laugh, trying to pull his hand free without injury. Max's muzzle rumpled with fond determination as he kept tugging the stooping, wincing man toward the back door. His ears were rapturously flattened, and Cat slid off the porch to rub at Beck's ankles jealously. Cats came with this house, and rodent pets of Donald that died of escaping from their cages. The three children all had noisy friends, and Bea herself would spend many a morning and afternoon entertaining housewives from the neighborhood or from Briarcliff Manor or Pleasantville. Old friends from the Rodney days, curious perhaps to glimpse the notorious author. In the suburbs, at least since Peyton Place, all authors are sui generis notorious, whom Bea, of all people, had somehow landed. If these visitors were there for morning coffee, they gave Bech little more than bright-eyed, wide-awake smiles above the crisp dickies stuck in their cashmere sweaters. But if he came upon them amid the lengthening shadows of the cocktail hour, slouched around second drinks in a murky corner of the timbered living room, these Gentile housewives would dart toward him, blurred, expectant glances, and merriment waxing reckless, challenge him to put them in a book. Alas, what struck him about these women, in contrast to the women of his travels and of Manhattan, was just their undetachability from these, to him, illegible Westchester surroundings. Without so many inducements to flee upstairs, Bech might never have settled into his silver room, but it was the one spot in the vast house where he did not seem to be in the middle of a tussle or a party or a concert. The twin girls especially could not bear to be out of range of amplified music. They were 15 when Bech became their stepfather, rather bony, sallow girls with Rodney's broad forehead and solemn, slightly bulging gray eyes. They lolled on the sofa or upstairs in their room reading fat novels of witchcraft and horror in Maine, while bathed in the clicking thud and apocalyptic lyrics of reggae. Donald, who had inherited more of Bea's curves and shades of humid pink, was 10, and for a time carried everywhere with him a battery-powered CB unit on which he attempted to chat with truckers rolling north beyond the woods. The sound of traffic, though kept at a distance, nevertheless permeated Westchester County, its pitch more sinister because concealed by greenery than the frank uproar of Manhattan.